The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in New York City sparkled with crystal chandeliers and golden decorations. Anthony Caruso stood at the altar, his dark suit perfectly tailored, his expression calm and commanding. Beside him, his bride Isabella wore a wedding dress that cost more than most people earned in a year. The ceremony brought together the most powerful families in the city's underground network. Guests filled every seat, their designer clothes and expensive jewelry reflecting the wealth and influence concentrated in this single room. Anthony's father, Dominic Caruso, sat in the front row with a satisfied smile. This marriage would unite two powerful families and strengthen their control over the docks and construction contracts throughout the 5 boroughs. As the priest spoke the traditional vows, Anthony's mind wandered to the empire he had built. He had risen through the ranks faster than anyone expected, proving himself ruthless when necessary and diplomatic when it served him better. His reputation was built on loyalty, respect, and an iron will that never bent. The reception began with champagne flowing freely and a live orchestra playing classic Italian melodies. Business associates mingled with family members, speaking in hushed tones about territories and opportunities. Anthony moved through the crowd with Isabella on his arm, accepting congratulations and knowing glances from men who understood the real purpose of this union. Among the 300 guests, one man stood apart. He wore a simple black suit, not the expensive designer brands favored by the others. His face remained partially hidden as he positioned himself near the bar, watching Anthony with an intensity that would have alarmed the security team had they noticed. But they were focused on known rivals and potential threats, not on this quiet stranger who had somehow obtained an invitation. The evening progressed with elaborate courses served on fine china. Speeches were made praising the couple and their families. Anthony's best man, Vincent, told carefully edited stories from their youth that made the crowd laugh. Isabella's father spoke about honor and tradition, his words heavy with meaning for those who understood the code. As the dancing began, Anthony led Isabella onto the floor for their first dance. The photographer captured every moment, creating images that would hang in their home and serve as reminders of this strategic alliance. Other couples joined them, and the ballroom filled with movement and music. The stranger at the bar ordered another drink, his eyes never leaving Anthony. He had waited years for this moment, planning every detail. Tonight, surrounded by family and friends, Anthony Caruso would face the truth he had buried so carefully. The stranger checked his watch and took a deep breath. Soon, everything would change. The moment came during the toasts. Vincent had just finished his speech when the stranger stepped forward from the crowd. His movement was deliberate, commanding attention without aggression. The security team tensed, hands moving toward concealed weapons, but the stranger raised his empty hands in a peaceful gesture. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom. "But I have something Anthony Caruso needs to hear, something all of you need to hear." Anthony's expression hardened. He gestured for his men to wait, his instincts telling him this was not a typical threat. There was something familiar about the stranger's voice, though he could not place it. Isabella gripped his hand, her face pale. "Who are you?" Anthony demanded, his tone controlled but dangerous. The stranger smiled sadly. "You really don't recognize me. I suppose 15 years changes a person, especially when everyone believes you're dead." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Dominic Caruso stood abruptly, his face losing color. Several older guests leaned forward, studying the stranger's features with growing recognition and shock. "My name is Marcus Caruso," the stranger continued. "Anthony's younger brother. The brother he left for dead in that warehouse fire in Brooklyn 15 years ago." The ballroom erupted in shocked whispers. Anthony's jaw clenched, but he remained silent, calculating his response. Isabella looked between her new husband and this man claiming to be his brother, confusion and fear evident in her eyes. Marcus pulled out an envelope from his jacket. I have evidence. Testimony from witnesses who saw Anthony that night. Financial records showing payments to the arsonist. Medical records proving my identity. This is ridiculous, Vincent interjected, stepping forward. Anthony, you don't have to listen to these accusations at your own wedding. But he will listen, Marcus said firmly, because everyone here knows the story. How Anthony's younger brother disappeared before Anthony's rapid rise to power. How convenient that Marcus vanished just when Anthony needed to prove himself capable of difficult decisions. Dominic moved toward Marcus, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something else. Guilt, perhaps, or recognition of a truth he had suspected but never confronted. Marcus, is it really you? Yes, Father, Marcus replied, his voice breaking slightly. I survived, barely. I spent 2 years in hospitals, another year learning to walk again. And all this time, I've been gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to return. Anthony finally spoke, his voice ice cold. Why now? Why at my wedding? Because you took everything from me, Marcus answered. My life, my future, my place in this family. Now I'm taking something from you, the illusion of respect. Everyone here will know what you did to your own blood for power. The orchestra had long since stopped playing. Guests stood frozen, witnessing a confrontation that would reshape the power structure of every organization represented in this room. Cell phones remained unused. No one wanted to be caught recording this moment, but everyone would remember it. Anthony's security team surrounded him as Marcus presented his evidence. Several family elders examined the documents, their faces grave. Isabella stood apart, processing the revelation that her new husband might have attempted to murder his own brother. The warehouse fire in Brooklyn, Marcus began, his voice steady despite the emotional weight. September 2010. Father had given us both a test. Whoever handled the problem with the dock workers' union would earn his trust and a real position in the organization. Dominic's face confirmed the truth. Several guests nodded, remembering the tension during that period when the younger Caruso sons competed for their father's approval. I had a plan to negotiate, Marcus continued. The union leaders were reasonable men, but Anthony had a different approach. He saw me as an obstacle, not a brother, so he arranged a meeting at that warehouse, told me he wanted to work together. The memories were clearly painful, but Marcus pushed forward. I arrived early. That's what saved my life. I heard them talking outside, Anthony and the man he'd hired. They were preparing to start the fire with me inside. I tried to escape through the back, but the flames spread too quickly. I don't believe this, Vincent protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Others in the room were studying Anthony's face, searching for denial that wasn't coming. I jumped through a window, Marcus said, fell 3 stories, broke both legs, my back, fractured my skull. A homeless man found me and called 911. I spent months in intensive care, registered under a false name because I knew if Anthony found out I'd survived, he'd finish the job. Isabella finally spoke, her voice trembling. Anthony, tell them this isn't true. Tell me this isn't true. Anthony remained silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The calculation behind his eyes was visible to those who knew him well. He was weighing options, considering consequences, planning his next move. The warehouse fire was investigated, Vincent offered. The official report said it was an accident, faulty wiring. Official reports can be purchased, Marcus replied, producing another document. Here's the original inspector's notes before they were changed, and here's the bank record showing a payment from one of Anthony's shell companies to that inspector's offshore account. Dominic slumped into a chair, looking decades older. The reality of what his eldest son had done to his youngest was settling over him like a heavy blanket. Other family members exchanged glances, silently recalculating their alliances and loyalties. For 15 years, I rebuilt myself, Marcus said, his voice gaining strength. I watched from the shadows as Anthony took what should have been mine. I saw him become the man Father wanted him to be, built on the foundation of my presumed death. The wedding guests began to fragment into groups, whispers growing louder. Some defended Anthony, others demanded answers. The carefully constructed alliance that this marriage represented was crumbling before it had even been solidified. Anthony Caruso finally stepped forward, his polished leather shoes clicking against the marble floor of the plaza's grand ballroom. The sound echoed in the silence that had fallen over the 300 guests. His composure remained intact, despite the chaos surrounding him, despite the accusations hanging in the air like smoke from a gun. His voice, when he spoke, cut through the noise with the same authority that had built his empire. "You want the truth? I'll give you the truth," he said, his dark eyes scanning the crowd before settling on his brother. The room fell silent again, the kind of silence that precedes earthquakes or revolutions. Everyone was desperate to hear his response. Isabella held her breath beside him, her wedding dress suddenly feeling too tight, too heavy. She still hoped for a denial that would make sense of this nightmare, some explanation that would let her breathe again. "Marcus is telling the truth," Anthony said simply, his words dropping like stones into still water. Gasps echoed through the ballroom, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers and gilded walls. Even those who had suspected, who had whispered theories over the years, now faced the shock of hearing Anthony admit it out loud. Dominic Caruso covered his face with his weathered hands, his shoulders sagging under the weight of this confession. Vincent stepped back from his best friend, his loyalty visibly shaken for the first time in 20 years. "But he's not telling you everything," Anthony continued, his gaze locked on his brother with an intensity that made several guests shift uncomfortably. "Tell them why Father gave us that test, Marcus. Tell them what you'd done to make him question your loyalty in the first place." Marcus's confident expression flickered like a candle in wind. His jaw tightened, and for the first time since he'd revealed himself, uncertainty crossed his features. "That's not relevant to this conversation," he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "It's absolutely relevant," Anthony pressed, taking another step forward. The movement was calculated, predatory in its precision. "You'd been skimming money from the dock operations, small amounts at first, a few hundred here, 1,000 there, but it added up, enough that Father noticed, enough that people started talking. Several of the older guests exchanged knowing glances. A few nodded slowly, remembering now the whispers from that time, the concerns that had circulated through their network about the younger Caruso son's reliability. "Father gave us both that test to see if you'd confess, to see if I'd turn you in," Anthony said, his voice carrying a note of old pain. "Neither of us did what he expected. You kept lying, and I decided to handle it my own way." "So you tried to kill me?" Marcus shouted, his composure finally breaking completely. His face flushed red, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "That was your solution? Murder your own brother because he made some mistakes?" "I tried to scare you," Anthony corrected, his tone measured but firm. "The fire was supposed to be small, controlled, nothing more than smoke and heat. You'd escape through the front door, the one I'd specifically left unlocked and clear. You'd realize how serious the situation had become, how dangerous your actions were making things for both of us. And then we'd go to Father together, tell him the truth, and figure out a solution as brothers." "You're lying," Marcus said, but doubt had crept into his voice like water through cracks in a foundation. Anthony reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his own envelope, this one thicker than Marcus's. "These are my records. Communications with the man I hired, Bruno Castellano, a man I've been paying to keep quiet for 15 years. His instructions were explicit and documented. Create a small fire in the south corner of the warehouse. Make noise. Give my brother a scare, but ensure he has a clear path to safety. Not murder, never murder." He pulled out several pages, holding them up for the crowd to see. Several family elders moved closer, their experienced eyes scanning the documents with the careful attention of men who'd spent lifetimes distinguishing truth from lies. When I found out you'd been seriously injured, that you'd jumped from a window trying to escape," Anthony continued, and for the first time genuine pain cracked through his controlled facade, "I thought I'd killed you. I spent months drowning in guilt, barely sleeping. When they told us you died, I wanted to confess everything, but Vincent talked me out of it." Vincent's head snapped up. "Anthony, don't—" "He reminded me that confessing wouldn't bring you back," Anthony said, looking at his oldest friend with something like regret. "That it would destroy the family, everything father had built. That your death, your sacrifice, however unintentional, couldn't be for nothing. So I took your place. I became what you should have been. Not from ambition, Marcus, from guilt. Every deal I made, every decision I took, every risk I faced, it was all to honor the brother I thought I'd killed." Isabella's expression shifted from horror to confusion to something more complex. She studied her new husband's face, seeing layers she'd never noticed before, the shadows under his eyes that never quite disappeared, the way he sometimes stared at nothing in the middle of conversations, the nightmares he'd never explained. Dominic finally spoke, his voice heavy with exhaustion and disappointment that seemed to age him decades in moments. "Both my sons betrayed me. One stole from the family. The other nearly killed his brother trying to handle it his own way. Neither of you came to me. Neither of you trusted me to handle it properly." The old man's words landed hard. Several guests looked away, uncomfortable witnessing such raw family dysfunction at what should have been a celebration. Others leaned in closer, recognizing that they were watching history unfold, a moment that would reshape the entire power structure of New York's underworld. "I was ashamed," Marcus said quietly, his anger deflating into something more vulnerable. "I'd gotten in over my head with some gambling debts. I thought I could cover it before anyone noticed. I thought I was being clever. And I was arrogant," Anthony admitted. "I thought I could fix everything on my own. I thought I knew better than father, better than our traditions. I thought I could control fire." The truth settled over the room like dust after an explosion. Not simple, not clean, but real. Marcus had survived, but he had also been guilty of betraying the family trust. Anthony had acted recklessly, dangerously, but perhaps not with the murderous intent Marcus had believed for 15 years. Neither brother was innocent. Neither was purely evil. They were human, flawed, caught in a moment that spiraled beyond either of their control. The silence stretched as guests processed this complexity. In their world, stories usually had clear heroes and villains. This messy reality was harder to navigate, harder to judge, harder to use for political advantage. "What happens now?" Isabella asked, her voice small in the vast space but cutting through clearly. She stepped forward to stand beside Anthony, her decision to stay by his side evident in that simple movement. "What do we do with all of this?" Anthony looked at Marcus, years of guilt and buried grief visible in his eyes for anyone who cared to look. His brother, alive, breathing, standing just 10 feet away, was a ghost made flesh, a nightmare and a miracle simultaneously. "You're my brother," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're alive. That's what matters most. Whatever you want, position in the family, money, territory, a legitimate business to run, it's yours. Just say the word. I'll give you everything I have if that's what it takes." Marcus stared at his brother, the revenge he'd planned for years suddenly feeling hollow in his chest. He'd spent 15 years imagining this moment, rehearsing the confrontation, savoring the thought of destroying Anthony's carefully constructed life. But the man before him wasn't the monster he'd built up in his mind during long, painful nights of recovery and plotting. This was his brother, older, harder, carrying his own scars even if they didn't show on his skin. "I don't want your empire," Marcus said finally, his voice breaking. "I don't want your money or your territories or your power. I want my brother back. I want the years we lost. I want to stop being angry, stop being alone, stop letting that night define everything I am." The two men stood facing each other as the ballroom watched in fascination. The string quartet had long since abandoned their instruments. Waiters stood frozen with trays of champagne. Security personnel kept their hands near their weapons, but made no moves, uncertain about what threat, if any, existed in this moment. Then Anthony stepped forward and embraced Marcus, both brothers holding on as if they could somehow erase 15 years of pain and separation through the simple act of physical connection. Marcus's carefully maintained composure shattered completely, and he sobbed into his brother's shoulder, for the boy he'd been, for the man he'd become, for all the time they'd lost. The wedding guests began to disperse slowly, understanding instinctively that they had witnessed something far more significant than a simple revenge revelation. This was a family destroying itself and somehow, impossibly, finding a path to reconstruction in the same moment. Conversations started quietly in corners, alliances being reconsidered, loyalties being re-evaluated. Isabella approached her new husband and his brother, placing a gentle hand on Anthony's shoulder. Whatever future they would build together would be built on this truth, complicated and imperfect as it was. She'd married into this family knowing it came with darkness, but she hadn't expected this particular shadow. Still, she was a daughter of this world too. She understood that survival meant accepting complexity. Dominic watched his sons, his expression unreadable, but his eyes wet. He knew that tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and necessary changes. The family structure would need to shift to accommodate Marcus's return. There would be questions about money, about power, about who controlled what. But tonight, against all odds and expectations, his family had survived its darkest secret coming to light. Both his sons were alive. That was more than many fathers in his position could say. Vincent approached cautiously, looking between the two brothers. "So, what's the plan?" he asked, his practical nature reasserting itself. "We can't just pretend this didn't happen. Half the city's major players just watched this unfold." Anthony released Marcus, but kept one hand on his brother's shoulder, as if afraid he might disappear again. "We tell the truth," he said. "Marcus was presumed dead. Now he's back. We deal with it as a family openly. Anyone who wants to use this against us will have to deal with both of us." "Together," Marcus added, wiping his eyes with no shame. "However this works, we figure it out together." The orchestra conductor, recognizing a cue when he saw one, lifted his baton. The musicians began playing again, softly at first, then with more confidence. A Sinatra classic filled the space, "My Way," and despite everything, several people laughed at the appropriateness of the song choice. A few guests returned to their tables. Others approached Anthony and Marcus, offering careful congratulations or support, or simply acknowledgement of what they'd witnessed. The mood had transformed from celebration to something stranger, a wake and a birth happening simultaneously. Isabella's father approached the brothers, his face stern. "This changes things," he said bluntly. "The arrangement between our families was predicated on certain understandings about structure and succession. Then we renegotiate," Anthony said calmly. "Marcus is family. That means he's part of any agreement we make. If that's a problem, we can dissolve the marriage. I won't let Isabella be caught in the middle of this." "Don't be ridiculous," Isabella interjected sharply. "I married you, Anthony. Not your empire, not your reputation. You. Whatever comes next, we handle it together. That's what marriage means." Her father studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll talk tomorrow. Tonight, let's try to salvage what's left of this celebration." As he walked away, Marcus turned to Isabella. "I'm sorry," he said genuinely. "This was supposed to be your perfect day. I ruined it." Isabella considered this, then smiled slightly. "It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in our world, real is often better than perfect. Welcome back, brother-in-law." The night continued in this strange new reality. Some guests left early, already plotting how to use this information to their advantage. Others stayed, drawn by the unusual authenticity of the moment. The Caruso family, so often hidden behind walls of secrecy and calculated moves, had been exposed in the most public way possible. And somehow they'd survived it. Anthony and Marcus spent the next hour talking quietly in a corner, catching up on 15 lost years. There was anger still and hurt, and questions that would take time to answer. But there was also relief, the relief of truth finally spoken, of burdens finally shared. Dominic joined them eventually, sitting heavily in a chair between his sons. "We have work to do," he said simply. "The family needs restructuring. Marcus needs to be reintegrated properly. There will be challenges, threats from those who see this as weakness." "Let them come," Marcus said, some of his earlier fire returning. "I've spent 15 years learning to survive. I'm not afraid of challenges." "And we're stronger together," Anthony added. "That's something I should have remembered 15 years ago." As midnight approached, the remaining guests began to leave. The wedding that everyone had expected to be a strategic alliance had become something far more complicated and, perhaps, more valuable, a moment of transformation, of family reunification against impossible odds. Isabella and Anthony stood at the ballroom's entrance, thanking guests for coming despite the chaos. Marcus stood with them, still somewhat overwhelmed by his return to this world, but determined to face it. When the last guest departed, the four of them, Anthony, Isabella, Marcus, and Dominic, stood in the nearly empty ballroom, surrounded by abandoned champagne flutes and wilting flower arrangements. "This wasn't how I planned to start married life," Isabella said, but her tone was light, almost amused. "Nothing in this family ever goes according to plan," Dominic replied with a tired smile. "But we adapt, we survive, and now, with Marcus back, we're complete again." The night was not over, but it had transformed into something no one had expected, not an ending, but a beginning. A family fractured had found a way to heal, imperfectly and publicly, but heal nonetheless. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought, they would face them together, all the secrets finally out in the open, all the shadows finally brought into light.